I'm going to introduce our moderator, and then he will go ahead and introduce the rest of our panel, and we'll get started. So Bruce Thompson has been with Frederick Community College since 1996 and is currently a full professor in history, as well as the coordinator for the award-winning honors program. His research focuses on the emergence of the civil rights movement in the 1930s in Maryland, a generation before the traditional narrative. He enjoys helping students discover the historical stories all around them. His educational journey includes bachelor's and master's degrees in history from Marshall University and a PhD in history from the University of Maryland. Bruce later served as a fellow at the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute at Harvard University. So that's Bruce, and he'll go ahead and introduce the rest of our panel.
Good evening. How are you all doing? Good. I didn't expect an applause. My students don't do that. All right. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you our three experts for the evening. And I'm going to have to ask questions I forgot to ask. Introduce you just before you do your presentation, or do all three of you now?
I would go ahead and do everybody, and then we can.
Got it. My fault. I didn't ask that question to start with. All right. So we'll start with Jody Brummage. Joined the staff of Heritage Frederick in 2022 and currently serves as the archivist and museum manager. In his role, Jody oversees the Frederick County Archives and Research Center, connecting scholars and genealogists with Heritage Frederick's extensive manuscript, library, photographic, and ephemeral collections. Over the past 15 years, Jody has worked to connect people to historical resources through archives and museum positions. He is passionate about researching and engaging the public in Frederick County's unique and significant history. In addition to his role at Heritage Frederick, Jody is also the president, historian, and curator for the South Mountain Heritage Society in Burkittsville. He holds a bachelor's degree in public history from Shepherd University and a master's of archives and records administration from San Jose State University. Welcome, Jody. Next, we have Elizabeth Anderson Comer. She serves as the president of the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society Incorporated. Ms. Comer is an archaeologist who has successfully managed more than 350 archival and archaeological survey, testing, and excavation projects, as well as historic architectural surveys, evaluation, and recordation tasks. Ms. Comer graduated from Hood College with a BA in History of Political Science and received her master's degree from the University of Kansas in anthropology with a specialization in archaeology. She's ABD at the University of Maryland, currently completing her PhD in American Studies with a concentration in archaeology. She has also studied at the University of London. As city archaeologist for the city of Baltimore, she directed and managed the archaeological department for the city and developed a public archaeology program replicated across the U.S. In her volunteer position at the Catoctin Furnace Historical Society Incorporated, Ms. Comer has successfully pursued bond bills, grant monies, and other funding totaling $3.8 million to restore 6 historic structures, open and operate a museum, produce 7 annual events, build a blacksmith shop and 2 interpretive trails, to stabilize the walls of the Ironmaster's Mansion, create virtual reality digital twin recreations of missing structures such as the quarters of the enslaved, and operate the circa 1820 Forgeman's House as an overnight historic stay experience. Welcome.
Jody, can you adjust the blinds? Now there's a spotlight. Nice. Thank you.
He does it all.
That's part of the museum director.
Museum manager.
Right.
All right, finally we have, last but not least, Amanda Venable. Is the museum manager of Rose Hills Manor Park and Museums, having served in different capacities at the museum since 2010. Her current role includes overseeing programming and docent staff, exhibits, collections, and historic research and cultural landscapes about the property. Amanda's career began as a secondary history teacher, and she has spent the last 5 years merging her work in the education field with the museum to design thoughtful educational programs and tours for youth scaffolded by age to discuss and learn about slavery and its impact on Rose Hill and the Frederick community. She holds a bachelor's degree in history from Washington College and a master's degree in curriculum and instruction from George Washington University. As Jody alluded to earlier, each of them we're going to give an overview of their historic sites and current research going on, and then we'll have a conversation about that.
Well, welcome everybody to Heritage Frederick. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have been here to the museum before? Love to see it. That's awesome. So many of you are familiar with the story of this property. It's been told to generations of Frederick citizens now for the past 60 years that this has been a museum for the county. But the story that's been told about this property has evolved, thankfully, in the way that we refer to the occupants of this house, in the way that we work to consider all of the lives lived within these walls and on these grounds throughout more than 200 years now of history. So this historic structure began its life as a private residence built in the mid-1820s by a man named Dr. John Frederick Baltzel. He lived here with his wife Ruth, their 10 children, and as many as 8 enslaved people. We do not have names of all of those enslaved people, but we have names of a few. We know that early on there was an enslaved woman named Betty and her children Sarah and Samuel, who were manumitted by Dr. Baltzel in the 1820s, around the time period of the construction of the house. But Dr. Baltzel did own this land before the house was built, and it is possible that there was a structure on the site before the present house. We also know that there was an enslaved man named Michael Hill who lived here and worked in the house until 1850, when he was manumitted by Dr. Baltzel. And he moved to Leonardtown in St. Mary's County, from where his story currently goes dark. We don't know about him beyond his removal to Leonardtown, but we do know that he would have had the possibility to encounter people that he knew in this household, because one of Dr. Baltzel's daughters, Fanny, married into the Key family, and they lived in Leonardtown. Michael did not live with them. We know that he, in 1850, was living with a lawyer named Robert Ford and his wife Ellen as a free man in Leonardtown. But in addition to Fanny and her husband and their family, when Dr. Baltzel died in 1854, his wife Ruth moved from here to Leonardtown. And that was where she died a few years later. And lastly, we know about a family unit who were living here, working in the house in 1854 when Dr. Baltzel died. And that was a woman named Hester Ann Diggs, who you will hear more about in the conversation tonight, because she is one of these connecting stories revealed through collaborative research that inspired tonight's program. But Hester lived and worked here and gave birth to 3 children born enslaved here. A daughter named Anne, a son named John Thomas, and another daughter named Emma. She would have 2 more children who were born free after she was manumitted by Dr. Baltzel's wife in 1855, and remained living here in Frederick as a free woman until the Civil War. And I'll save a bit of her story for later in the program, but we do know more about her journey into freedom. When Dr. Baltzel died, this house was sold to a merchant in Frederick named Alexander Baird Hansen. He was originally from Kent County on the Eastern Shore. He purchased the house here and moved in with his wife and their adult son, George, and his wife, Courtney, whose portraits you can see hanging in the hallway out front. And we know that while they were living here, there were at least 3 enslaved people living in the house. A man named William Henry, and also a woman named Margaret Ann, and a man named John. And Margaret Ann and John were brother and sister. Their mother's name was Mary, and we know that because it was recorded in their manumission, this familial unit. But they had actually been manumitted by Alexander Hansen. And when we say that word manumitted, that is the legal process by which you took an enslaved person out of the state of enslavement and granted them freedom. It was a document recorded in the land records of the Frederick County Courthouse. And so that's where you see them existing today. But those manumissions could come in different forms. And some of those manumissions were not immediate. And that was the case with both William Henry, Margaret Ann, and John. All of their manumissions were recorded in the 1830s, but they were still enslaved and working on this property up until the American Civil War. So because their manumissions were not in effect yet. By the way it was documented, they had to reach a certain age before their freedom was granted. So traditionally, when you would come to this museum and hear the story of the house, you would hear about Dr. Boltzel, you would hear about Colonel Hansen, you would also hear about the third owner of the house, John Lotz, who also was an enslaver, although by the time that he was living on this property, slavery had ended in Maryland. Chattel slavery, that is. And so none of the enslaved people that he owned ever lived or worked on this property in this house. But certainly the wealth that Lotz possessed was derived from the fact that he enslaved people. And that wealth translated into the second chapter of life of this property. So when John Lotz died in 1878, he willed that the house be turned into a home for orphan girls. And so from 1882 until 1956, this was known as the Lotz Female Orphan Home. And about 100 women grew up here over that time period. You can learn a lot about their stories in an exhibit upstairs on the second floor. And then that chapter concludes in 1956, and in 1959, this building became the Historical Society of Frederick County. Ever since, it has been a museum. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, that's a story that has evolved and changed. But one of the exciting things that was recently revealed in work done in this space that we're gathered in tonight, this was renovated last year over the winter break. And if you look over here to the side, you can see what remains of the old kitchen fireplace of the house. So originally, there was a wall dividing this room into 2. And actually right here where the screen is was where a back stairway once came all the way from the attic down to the basement. That stairway still survives on the second floor. It's actually my favorite place to take visitors in the building because there's so much original fabric left in that tiny space that tells us about the evolution of this house. But that was, until last year, covered by closets when you would come in this room. So you could not see that chimney. And at some point, they actually removed part of it and canted it into the wall. And we know when that was done, they inserted a stovepipe into the chimney. But if you go down to the basement underneath it, there is a massive brick vaulted structure that would have supported the hearth under that original cooking fireplace. And so being able to see that again in the space is really important because we don't have portraits, we don't have objects, we don't have anything that personally belonged to any of the people I've described tonight. But fortunately on the property, there are tangible pieces of the setting that survive that we can use to learn more about their stories. So I'll share some more as we continue to converse, but I'll pass it on to
So Rose Hill, how many have been to Rose Hill before? So Rose Hill Manor is a former plantation site. It was purchased by Governor Thomas Johnson during his governorship. And we don't really know what he was doing for the next 10 years with it, whether renting it out or growing crops on it or what, but he gives it to his daughter as kind of part of her dowry when she gets married to John Graham in 1788. And from then on, for the next 50 years, the plantation really serves as a one key piece in a large industrial complex of businesses operated by the Johnson and Graham families, of which I won't go into too depth because I have an expert sitting right next to me on that. Normally I have to give a much bigger depth on that, but I can save that portion of it. But it included the iron furnaces ranging from Loudoun County through almost into Pennsylvania, and also 2 glass works, one which is on the site of the Frederick County landfill today, and one which is Tuscarora Creek, just above Rose Hill, just a few miles from Rose Hill, as well as a large network of merchants in the family and grain and tobacco plantations. And really Rose Hill being in the middle of that, likely growing not only grain that they were taking to Baltimore to sell, as Frederick County is at one point the largest grain producer in the nation, while Rose Hill was a grain farm, but also as subsistence for this enslaved population that is going between all of these industrial sites. And so what we have really tried to unearth over time is, for a long time, are similar to Jody's point of interpretation and how it has changed. A lot of time we really stopped at Thomas Johnson. Nobody else, not even his own children, were really mentioned all that much. For a long time, it was just Thomas Johnson. And as some of these huge networks of research have tried to work together, especially in 2020 with a lot of digitization and some pivots that we had to take, we really looked at what do we know about these families and how they were operating these properties, including really narrowing down when Thomas Johnson actually moves to live with his daughter, and what happens to the 50 enslaved people that he had at his Richfield plantation just before he moves to Rose Hill. What we have seen across time in our research with the Johnson and Graham family is, and I'm assuming talk more about this depending on how our conversations go, but they're moving enslaved across these industries. We have documents talking about moving them from one glassworks to another or an iron furnace to another. They're moving the enslaved across family members, some of that because of the intense skilled labor that they had, and so that they wanted to keep within the family businesses. And also, as we will talk about with Hester and renting out when their economic situations or financial situations were not in the best place. We also at Rose Hill have expanded our interpretation for the next 100 years of history that the house had afterwards, which included another family similar to here Heritage Frederick, is another family called the Thomas family, who were also enslavers. And they really represent a whole different era of enslavement in Frederick County, as the industrial inventions in agriculture start making enslaved labor less important to farming in Frederick County. We see those gradual manumissions increase in the area. And so the Thomas family represents a family that had multiple plantations touching all the way from Rose Hill to today at the airport, the Frederick Airport, and an enslaved labor that moved across those plantations and also had a mixture of free and enslaved within their households, and what those dynamics look like across that. And that was the Thompson and Robinson families, who were the enslaved and free families. And Anne Robinson had children in all statuses of slavery, enslavement, and freedom, including across multiple enslavers, and some that were enslaved living in her own household while she was free. and some children born free as well. And so it's a very different dynamic than we're used to hearing when we talk about slavery, just across one family and one woman's children. And then we see Rose Hill as a tea room post or the turn of the 20th century. And that still has some of that legacy of slavery in it, as the domestic servants that were working in the tea room were that all of them that we know of were African American, including Bessie Caesar, whose father was enslaved. She was born after the Civil War. Her mother was born free. And she was able to use her work at the tea room to purchase a house in Bartonsville for her family, for her sister and her family, which is, you know, a large post-emancipation community of African Americans in the county. So we see all kinds in just one household and one property, all different moments of the impact of slavery and an institution here in Frederick.
Well, hard act to follow, but first of all, I'll ask the question, how many of you have been to Catoctin Furnace? All right, that's great.
To the choir here.
Okay, great. Well, thrilled to be here and to share a little bit about Catoctin Furnace, because it is, it's an incredibly important story and it's an incredibly important site. It has so many things that I can talk about. I'm going to try to focus in on, of course, the enslaved, but it's also an accident of history that we know as much as we do about Catoctin Furnace. The narrative of Catoctin Furnace at the time, mid-century, when the Historic Preservation Act was passed in 1966, was one of the European Americans. Thomas Johnson. Was there anybody else? The first governor of Maryland. He was one of the owners of Catoctin Furnace. And so that was sort of when the bicentennial came around 50 years ago. That was one of the things, the stories, if you will, that people could tell and it make a connection to the past 200 years and the importance of Catoctin Furnace. But then, because of the Eisenhower administration and the need for roadways to get people out of the metropolitan areas into areas like Pennsylvania and the mountains, Route 15, which was the small road called Catoctin Furnace Road, was seen as being inadequate. And so Eisenhower, as you know, had gone to Europe. He saw these, autobahns. He's like, oh, we need interstates, which we started building across the country. And Route 15, while it's not an interstate, was this part of that, modernity that we were experiencing in the 1960s. So with the Historic Preservation Act of 1966, the idea that the effect of something like a roadway construction would have on historic and archaeological features was recognized. A lot of people look at the loss of Pennsylvania Station in New York as being a catalyst for that major historic preservation movement and the passage of the Historic Preservation Act. So there was an archaeological investigation of this proposed roadway construction. And sure enough, as they're going from Hanson, from Frederick all the way to the Pennsylvania line, digging shovel test pits at an interval, they get to Catoctin Furnace. The first two shovel test pits they excavate, first one hits bone. They go a little further, maybe 10, 15 feet, excavate another one, and it hits bone. So at that point, it was very clear, obviously, that there was a cemetery there. And so the idea of excavating it and letting the roadway then be constructed was the norm of the time. And that's why Catoctin Furnace has this unbelievably powerful set of data that are the people in the African American cemetery and their remains. There were 35 graves excavated. 32 had skeletal remains. 3 of them, there are lots of reasons bone doesn't survive. It's acidic soil. They could be neonates, so the bones are very small. There are many reasons, but at any rate, the archaeologists recognized immediately, given the shape of the crania and the way in which the teeth were, the characteristics of the teeth and the characteristics of their vertebrae, that they were African Americans, and so took them to the Smithsonian, where they've been curated ever since. And 12 years ago, we began a reanalysis because we knew that now we had DNA, we had things that nobody had in the 1970s and early 80s when this took place, and now we're finding the descendant community that is related to this population. So it really is it is groundbreaking research, and it is expanding not just our knowledge of enslavement and the industrial work at Catoctin, but it's changing the lives of these individuals who now know that they're directly descended from skilled iron workers. One of the other things we look at Catoctin is the idea, and not just the idea, but the knowledge transfer, because we now know, based on the DNA, where these individuals came from in Africa. So we've been able to trace the iron making skills to specific areas. Iron making was ubiquitous across the continent of Africa, but there are some areas that were more sort of known, if you will, for iron making. So it's a fascinating thing. So the other thing about that Amanda and Jody were saying is this cross-pollination, and that is so important because we're finding connections between Rose Hill and, for instance, one of our families, Hanson Summers, who was at Catoctin. His sister or first cousin is buried in the cemetery, and we've been able to trace him through Catoctin to William Johnson's house, to Rose Hill, back to Catoctin, and then to Antietam Iron Works, where all of the enslaved, or I should say, the majority of the enslaved were moved in the 1840s after another sale of the furnace. The furnace was one of these places that, like many businesses, was subject to dramatic times of great wealth, for instance, during the War of 1812, and then great poverty, for instance, in the Panic of 1819. So up and down and around and around. But anyway, moved to Antietam, and then the family still lives in the area of Hagerstown. So that's the sort of research that we're undertaking. But it's all connected. And the other thing that we've been doing is a project called Recovering Identity, in which we've really rewritten the history of Northern Frederick County, finding, for instance, Henry Williams, who then moved to Frederick, built 2 lovely log houses on Water Street in Thurmont. And Thurmont's like, no way. And we're like, yeah, way. And so we've got all of these properties now, these cultural landscapes, as well as standing structures that really that tell, that Northern Frederick County had a very connected, if you will, African-American population until approximately 1910. And there are many reasons for that. And I'm from Northern Frederick County, so I can say that one of the reasons, well, I'm not from there, but I grew up there. One of the reasons it might be, it wasn't a very friendly place for African Americans in the 20th century, but also all the social and religious, all the organizations, all of the family, it was all here in Frederick or in other places. So there wasn't much in Northern Frederick County to keep the African American population there, in addition to some very unfortunate, the existence of the Ku Klux Klan, for instance, in Rocky Ridge. So we've been looking at that in some detail. One of the things that's helped us is the translation of the Moravian diaries. The Moravians came into Northern Frederick County in the early 18th century. They kept copious notes and wrote many letters, and we've been able to translate every year of those from German, and that's helped us immensely to understand how people moved through space and time, what the epidemics might have been, what the weather was like, what the religious atmosphere was like, you know, how people really, it's maddening in one way because they're never given or seldom given a name, but on the other hand, it's very fruitful in that it tells us a great deal. It tells us things we would never know otherwise. So Catoctin is there because of the Historic Preservation Act, or I should say the Historical Society is there because of the Historic Preservation Act of 1966. And as I said, this accident of history of the roadway, but we are making the most of those. And one of the things that I'm the most excited about is that in this past year, the descendants, and that's writ large, the African-American descendants as well as the European-American descendants of the ironworkers have formed a group called the Friends of Catoctin Furnace. And that group is very active. They're having reunions, they're having fundraisers, they're really bringing their story to the fore, and even writing a book about about many of focusing first and foremost on a gentleman by the name of Robert Patterson, who was at Catoctin as a free African-American ironworker and collier. So that's it, a little bit. Sorry, I've gone on too long, but it's all connected, as you can see, all across the county and beyond, into Pennsylvania, into Virginia.
I'm just blown away. I don't know about you. All right, let me follow up because you got me curious. So I hear Catoctin, I hear Rose Hill, I hear
Richfield.
Richfield, thank you. I can picture where that is. So I'm up and down 15. That one's pretty obvious. Is that the only connections geographically speaking?
So, I have a map that is,
Oh, that's why I wanted to-
updated.
I
I
wanted a
don't
map.
have it with me, but I do have a map, and actually I was working on some research this week where I was like, this Johnson family, but, when you start taking all the properties, it goes through a straight line right through the center of Frederick County, all the way. Like I said, so when you cross the bridge from, Frederick into, I always get the bridges confused, into Loudoun County, you almost hit that wall, right? You gotta make the immediate turn. That's called Furnace Mountain.
Yes.
And it's called Furnace Mountain because the Johnsons had an iron furnace on it. Thomas Johnson and his brother James, they both had children, got married, first cousins, and they each were given half of that iron furnace to hold together in their marriage. And so we have documents of the enslaved being moved across because by law you had to petition the governments to move the enslaved across state lines. So we have some documents that name some of those individuals at different times that had to be moved back and forth between Maryland and Virginia. But it really starts from there, and actually even DC, Alexandria, or Georgetown, they were buying lots and things in that area. But all the way from Loudoun County to Sugarloaf Mountain, where they operated an iron furnace, and then the glassworks. They had several other kind of farms at different times that the families owned, and some of the extended families, they're married into the McPherson family that owned lots of what is today the Rockelsey Battlefield. So the family owned portions of that as well. Right into Rose Hill, like you said, Richfield, Springfield Manor, the winery, is James Johnson's, was Thomas Johnson's brother, and for a long time was co-owner of Catoctin Furnace. So they have Springfield Manor. If you've ever looked at Rose Hill and Springfield, they're the exact same house except flipped, including the ice house in the corner. And then Catoctin Furnace, they own the brothers after the Revolutionary War, did a lot of land speculating along the handle of Maryland into Allegheny and Garrett County. They bought up a lot of, if you heard of post-revolution, a lot of the Continental Congress didn't have money. They paid their soldiers for their service in land lots. Those lots were way far away from where the soldiers actually lived, and they needed money. And so speculators like the Johnson brothers came in and said, well, we have an opportunity for you, and bought hundreds, talking like 600 or more lots in Allegheny County of 50 acres at a time, so they owned over 20 to 30,000 acres of land in Allegheny County. Last week I was looking into land they own in Somerset, which is just north in PA,
Pennsylvania,
which is just north, and then all the way into Connellsville, Pennsylvania, which is also iron industry land. And so when you look at it on a map, not only is it, like you said, geographically connected, but it is all along waterways and iron ore banks specifically. So it's very strategic in what they're doing as well. And you see that with Thomas Johnson being such a big partner with George Washington and trying to get the Potomac River to be navigable, because they want to, and I even forgot Antietam Furnace, I'm so bad at the Green Springs, all of those furnace and Hampton. But purposefully trying to find ways to move those industries, those products that they're creating as much as they can through those waterways, so.
But even before that, they're coming from Culver County, they're in Annapolis, and then they're seeing Frederick County as being a real land of opportunity. They're really, believe it or not, when you came across Pennsylvania and you dropped down into the Great Valley, which is right on the other side of our mountains, that was really settled very early. Frederick County, interestingly enough, and Paula Reed has done a great deal of research on this, was really, I mean, I'm not going to say it was a backwoods, but it was backwoods compared to the Great Valley. And so the Johnsons, realized, had surveyors out here, realized what was available, and then, as Amanda said, started buying up this land and being, major movers and shakers in Frederick County. Yes, and then, as I said, when they moved the enslaved, they invested in this, that, and the other thing. The Johnsons and the later owners of Catoctin, the Brins, the McPhersons, they're all connected. And they would lose one enterprise because they would, borrow too much money and there would be a panic, or they would just not be able to make enough money to pay their creditor and would sell it and then move on to another place. And that's how the enslaved from Catoctin ended up at Antietam. So it was just marching people literally from one enterprise to another. But the idea that they were keeping people because they were skilled, but also, we always think, what, you're 7 miles before the Fugitive Slave Act, when you're at Catoctin, you're 6 to 7 miles from freedom. You're very, very close. So how are you going to keep people, theoretically, from just leaving? Well, one of the ways I think that the Johnsons did this was because they kept families together. And that was not because I can't dial back and say what their motivation was, but I think the result was that, you've got a nuclear family and you're going to keep them together, and that's going to keep people from being as apt, if you will, to seek their freedom. And that doesn't mean people didn't. There's this wonderful ad that you just want them to have gotten, to have not been recaptured. And that's Gabriel from Savannah. So Gabriel was here at Auburn. He was at the Johnson, he was at Catoctin Furnace, and he ran away with Peter Dorsey. Well, Peter was from here. He was from Maryland. But Gabriel, and I just flew in from Savannah last night, so I know how far it is, right? He was from Savannah. He belonged to Edward Telfair. Edward Telfair was the first governor, the first provincial governor of Georgia, and of course, Thomas Johnson was the first provincial governor of Maryland. And so here are these two gentlemen. They're 6.5 miles from freedom. And I can think, Gabriel is like, there is no way in hell that I'm going back. I mean, there were, of course, there was the possibility of going to one of the sea islands and trying to get away that way, but really a bit problematic. But this was so close, freedom. And so I can just imagine Gabriel saying, I'm not going back. And somebody needs to pick up this research who has more time than we do or than I do. Because, you know, is there anything in Savannah about, I ask questions at all the Telfair houses I could get to in that short amount of time, but are there any records about Gabriel? Somebody's saying, you know, this gentleman, you know, went to Maryland and never came back, or did he? Was he recaptured? You know, it would be interesting to see. So I digress, but Gabriel's one of my heroes. I just hope.
We were just talking about that, so I put it in your mind.
Yeah.
Well, I'll restrain myself. Do you all have questions?
I do. Very interested to know where in Africa the enslaved came from.
So this is really interesting. So we've been able to find like the specific ethno-linguistic groups like the Wolof, the Fula, mostly West Africa, but also what is now Nigeria. But we can tell how many ethno-linguistic groups each individual is related to. So for instance, one of our moms is related to just 2 ethno-linguistic groups, and they're very closely geographically related. I mean, Africa is a huge continent, so these 2 ethno-linguistic groups are very close in West Africa. And so she is probably a very recent arrival in the New World. And we have another toddler who is related to 9 ethno-linguistic groups. And they go from the north in basically Tunisia all the way to Zanzibar and several places in between. So what we're speculating is that toddler's family is descended from people who had been in the New World for multiple generations, because the idea, you know, there was this attempt to keep people separated from, you know, people of their own, you know, location or tribe, and who could share language and perhaps, share critical information that would be adverse to, to the slave owners. But that kind of intermarrying, if you will, through 3,000 plus miles is just did not happen. I mean, that is not something that happened in Africa, is what I'm saying. Yeah.
You were able to trace that through DNA research?
Yes, that's all through DNA. It's very precise. We're using direct-to-consumer databases, and that's how we're finding. We have a new protocol called Identical by Descent, or IDB, and it's very, very, very precise. So it's looking at the exact length of DNA on the exact same location on the strand of DNA. So it's an incredibly, and it's so precise that it's probably, it's so accurate that it's leaving people out who probably are more closely related than we're seeing. But we're also very cognizant that some of these direct-to-consumer databases, I mean, we get people who email us and say, we're related to somebody at Catoctin, and then we look at at the data, and they are related, but they're related, 61,000 years ago. And so we're all related. Newsflash, 61,000 years ago. So
Is that kind of research expensive?
Well, not if you're Harvard.
Okay, is Harvard involved?
Yes,
Oh,
it's
okay.
the lab. So we got I thought this was a big grant years ago. It was $14,000. I was like, oh my gosh. The first grant first research grant we ever got, but it took 3 years to get it. It's a long story. It was really hard to get. And so we only had enough money to do 2 sequences, genome sequences. And we connected with Harvard, and they're like, well, we don't really need the money. And we're like, okay. So they
may need it soon, from what I hear.
Yeah, that's true. So they did 15 genomes, and they were all successful. And then we did 14 more. So we have a total of 29. Now, of that, some are more degraded than others, so there's a lot of, there is some variability, but some of them are excellent.
Did they leave any cultural traces?
There are sassafras leaves, a corona of sassafras leaves, probably a fall burial. The men have some buttons that are just hand-me-down type, the women have no buttons. No, there are no. The archaeology was done very well for 1979 and 1980. We would do it very differently now, quite frankly. We would keep all of the soil from the crania, from the thoracic. We would keep everything, and we would subject it to tests that would show us, for instance, whether they were taking any medicine. We would look, and we still can, if we can get permission, do plaque analysis to see exactly what they were eating, perhaps what their disease conditions were at the time of death. So but right now, the Smithsonian's not too keen on any sort of, we got in right before everything went to hell in a handbasket, basically.
Now, did they go to specific areas in Africa, West Africa in particular, where there was a lot of iron mining? Were they looking for a specific scale or?
Some people have speculated, but my research has indicated that, frankly, the transatlantic slave trade was never that organized. You didn't put in an order like, but once, but the flip side of that is that and we know this from some ads from Virginia, not from Catoctin, but they would, there's one ad that mentions a gentleman who cannot speak English, but he's a really good blacksmith. So they were looking at skills. And again, I use this analogy. I grew up on a dairy farm and I live in Baltimore now, but I still know the difference between hay and straw. I know how to milk a cow. I know how to back a wagon. I wouldn't want to try it. But my point is, once you learn that, once you're exposed to it as a child, it's there. And so even if these people were not, specifically chosen for their iron making skills, that skill set and that knowledge came with them, and these owners took advantage of it.
And one of the things that we see too with that is that this vast network, I call it Business and Love. We have an exhibit right now. It's about to change for our 250th exhibits, but at Rose Hill, that looks across even just Maryland at the families. So these two individuals that Elizabeth was talking about that run from Catoctin Furnace. One of them is Peter Dorsey. In his ad, he talks about being from Elk Ridge Furnace originally. And the extended Johnson family is married into the Dorsey families from Elk Ridge. They're also married into the families that are operating Nottingham Furnace in different ways. Even John Graham, who is the son-in-law of Thomas Johnson, his father is a slave trader in Calvert County and is part of that Nottingham Iron Furnace. And so what we've started tracing in our joint research is the ability to trace even enslaved that are at Rose Hill, who have been within the family for generations and through those extended networks. So while they might not be specifically importing people from Africa with the knowledge, once they're here, once they're doing ironwork here, they're continuing to keep those family members in the family. And sometimes it's very frustrating for our research because they keep private records of where the enslaved go. It's made it much more difficult compared to large sale ads where you can find like, oh, they're purchasing, people from a slave ship, or they're purchasing people from somewhere else, because it's all within the family. So they don't need to write it down, or they kept it within the family papers that are gone, or et cetera. So
another factor that contributes to this when we look county-wide, agriculture in Frederick County in the 18th century and really the first half of the 19th century is really chiefly focused on grain cultivation. That is the chief crop grown in Frederick County. So much so that in the time of the Revolution, what inspired one of our exhibit titles, Cultivating Independence, this was part of the breadbasket of the country. But grain is not, in relative to other crops, grain is not a labor-intensive crop. And so the enslaved laborers that are working either on the larger plantation scale farms around Frederick County or on the smaller single family type farms that were more common among the German settlers of Frederick County, they are more likely to be engaged in various trades. They're not solely a field laborer who only knows how to cultivate a single crop, like cotton, like we would think of typically in the South, deeper South. So we know from, especially from ads that appeared in the newspapers locally, that lots of the enslaved people in Frederick County possessed multiple skills, multiple trades. Blacksmiths are a common one. One example that I have tried to trace in southwestern Frederick County, there was a large plantation called Needwood, which was owned by the second governor of Maryland after Thomas Johnson, Thomas Sim Lee. And Thomas Sim Lee was the second largest, sometimes the largest enslaver in Frederick County. We know that at the time of his death, based on his estate inventory, one of the activities that was going on at Needwood was distilling. There's equipment, there's supplies, there's agricultural products that are associated with distilling at Needwood in 1819, the year that Thomas Sim Lee dies. Thomas Sim Lee's grandson was a man named Outerbridge Horsey, whose name you can't forget once you've heard it. But he established a very lucrative rye whiskey distillery on a portion of the Needwood plantation that he inherited from his mother, Eliza Lee Horsey. And when you look at the census records in the 1870s, 1880s, there are two African-American families who I have not thus far been able to exactly trace if they were formerly enslaved by Horsey, but they're working as distillers at the distillery. And we know that a lot of the enslaved families that were connected to Needwood remained in that area. There are several small African-American communities, enclaves situated along South Mountain, in the Petersville, Knoxville areas around Brunswick. Part of that is because the growth of the railroad after the Civil War provided a source of employment that led to the creation of an African-American community in Brunswick. So we know that a lot of these families stick around. And so seeing how those trades and skills pass down generations, even once we get past the Civil War, past emancipation, those skills continue to be a binder for these communities that existed around Frederick County, even into the early 20th century.
So that's what I'm more familiar with Frederick County, and these little enclaves, so forth, particularly they come up into the 20th century, where I did my research. So that's leading to the question. So we have this great connection here with all these slaves going, or slaves going back to what? We've got this group down here, this part of the county. The people who lived in and worked here in this building, were they connected? What connections did they have? And I'm sitting here thinking, we got all these different enclaves, and
right.
Like, do they interconnect, or they stay within their little lanes?
Yeah. Lots of connections in different ways. One of them that we kind of mentioned earlier is Hester Ann. I'll start it and pass her story to you. So Hester Ann appears at Rose Hill at the death of Anne Graham in 1837. We don't really know how she got to Rose Hill. We have lots of questions about that because just 5 years before that, her husband had died, and Hester is not listed in his inventory of enslaved. And so whether Anne Graham held enslaved people separately is always a possibility, though we don't see that in census records or anything indicating that, or whether the family members like John McPherson, who held the mortgage of Rose Hill at that time, or other family members after they had to sell the enslaved that when John Graham dies, whether they give Anne Graham, who's in her 60s, has never cooked a day in her life, has never done her own laundry, has not done anything, you're going to start giving in other enslaved individuals. So that's one of our goals, is to find out where Hester Ann came from, but we don't know that. But based on some records connected to the research that Catoctin Furnace has done, and Rick Smith, who has since passed away, some of his work in going through thousands of documents in court records and things, had the account of sale records for where the enslaved go when the estate is sold. And when I looked at Hester's, all of a sudden I said, John Boltzel. And I was like, wait a minute, I know where John Boltzel lives, and that is in Heritage Frederick. So that's what started Jody and I connecting on, what do you know about Hester? And so that started that. And then, so we know, while the estate of Anne Graham was being settled, if not maybe a little before, but I think it really was from the start of her death to when her full estate is settled, her executors rent out all of her enslaved. And so Hester Ann is rented out to John Boltzel before even being sold to John Boltzel, which gives us a little idea between what's going on in Rose Hill and here, that's most likely involved in different domestic labor, cooking, laundry, and things like that. She doesn't have any of her children at that point, and based on their birth dates, those all happen here at Heritage Frederick. But so yes, we know then the estate is finally settled and she's officially sold here to the Boltzels.
Yeah, so
How old she was at that point?
She was in her early 20s.
So prior to that research that Mandy mentioned, we knew of Hester. And the reason we knew of her was because she is listed on Dr. Boltzel's estate inventory in 1854. Her and 3 other enslaved people, who we now know are her children. We did not know that originally. But they are the only 4 enslaved people that were present on the property when it was inventoried after the death of Dr. Boltz. So again, as Amanda said, we can kind of infer what she would have been doing here, probably assisting with the children of the Boltzels. As I mentioned earlier, we are sitting in partly what was once the kitchen space of the house. There is only one surviving outbuilding on this property, and it has been incorporated into the house. But if you go back to where our restrooms are located, you are actually stepping into what was once the smokehouse of the property. And last year, while we were having some HVAC work done, I had the opportunity to climb through the hole in the ceiling back there and see as soon as you go up there, number one, you can instantly smell, it still smells like a smokehouse. That smell is baked into the rafters, the woodwork. The pegs that would have been used for hanging the meats as they were smoking are still up there. It's really remarkably preserved above that space. So we know that food preparation, gardening would have been tasks done here on the property. There was a stable on the property somewhere behind the house. We know that because Jacob Engelbrecht writes about when it burned down, so it had to exist at some point. There's always a question of would there have been, Dr. Boltzel was a doctor. We do not know for 100% certain if Dr. Boltzel was practicing medicine at the time he was living in this house. This house is built a little bit later in his life. And certainly we know that he had other connections to people. One of the things that we've recently talked about was how often he shows up as an executor,
Or a creditor
working
or
out
something.
with other people's estates and affairs. And he certainly was a prominent citizen of the town. But I think what's particularly curious to consider when we look at Hester's life on this property is to think about how small of a place this is, right? I mean, it might seem like a grand house, but it's not a huge place. And to think what was happening just outside the peripheral walls of this property. Frederick in Hester's lifetime was the scene of a growing free community. The 1820 census is when the number of enslaved people in Frederick County reaches its peak in terms of the biggest number. It decreases after that, and the number of free people increases. One key factor in that is the fact that between 1820 and 1830, between 1830 and 40, another county is carved out of Frederick County, which is Carroll County. That does affect the population numbers, but nonetheless, Frederick was this center of a growing free community. And when we look at finding where those communities existed, so much of what we consider the traditional narrative of Frederick's Black history centers, and rightfully so, around All Saints Street. Right? All Saints Street is looked at as the center of this separate community, Carroll Creek being a dividing line between Black and white Frederick. But that is really a late 19th century, early 20th century story. That is a reality that's shaped by Jim Crow. It's a reality shaped by the response to the end of Reconstruction in the United States. And when we look earlier than that, the population of Frederick was much more evenly dispersed between Black and white communities. There were concentrations of Black families living certainly on All Saints and South Bend Streets, on 3rd and 4th Streets, on West 7th and 6th Streets. And there are still landmarks that survive to mark those communities. Quinn Chapel AME Church on 3rd Street, the Laboring Sons Memorial Grounds up on 5th Street, the West 7th Street School still survives.
Hospital.
So yeah, all of those landmarks mark where these communities once existed that at the turn of the 20th century, within a space of a few years. One of the things you can look at are Sanborn fire insurance maps of downtown Frederick, and you will see all of these little enclaves along the alleyways connecting these streets that had once been centers of African American houses disappear. And that population really initially coalesces into two areas, West 7th and 6th Streets and All Saints. And eventually All Saints becomes the African American community that we still very much recognize and know about in Frederick today. So to think about living here as an enslaved person with such a changing world just outside the walls of this house, one of the things we also know, thanks to Jacob Engelbrecht, is that there were annual gatherings before the Civil War of African Americans, both free and enslaved together, that probably are the historical origins of what after the Civil War became the emancipation festivals that continued in Frederick up into the second quarter of the 20th century. And these gatherings in that post-Civil War period become very important galvanizers of resistance in Frederick, especially in the early 20th century as Jim Crow laws really begin to sweep in and change life for African American people in Frederick County. But there are origins of that way back in the 1850s, around the time that Hester would have been navigating her journey from an enslaved woman to a free woman living in Frederick. So what our research found, once she's freed and leaves the house here, she is counted on the 1860 census living in Frederick as a free woman with her husband. Her husband was enslaved, but not by Dr. Baltzell. His name was John Diggs, and we know that he was enslaved by the Eichelberger family. How he and Hester would have met is something we don't know. But as Amanda mentioned, this business network that linked all of these geographic and
So one of the reasons I
organizational
think that
places.
Hester Ann was in the Johnson family for longer, because the Eichelbergs and Johnsons are very close in the northern part of the
Right.
county.
Eichelberger Farm is on Blacks Mill Road.
Yeah, so there's
Yeah.
connections that we
East of
can't find
Duvernay's.
the documents for yet,
But John and Hester have two children, two sons, George and Daniel, who were born free in Frederick before 1860. John Diggs died in 1863. And there is a headstone for him that survives in Fairview Cemetery in Frederick, likely moved there from either the old All Saints burial ground on All Saints Street or possibly Laboring Sons or even possibly Green Mountain would not have been started at the time of his death, but laboring sons would have existed. But Hester at that point seems, again, we have to infer from the facts of what we know of where her life goes, because we don't have anything that survives in her own word, in her own hand. But what we know is that she decides to leave Frederick. She takes her youngest children because while she had been freed by Ruth Baltzel, her son, John Thomas, was sold to a man named John H. Williams, who was a banker and lawyer here in Frederick. His house is what we know today as Federated Charities on South Market Street, which actually would have been a neighboring house to Alexander Hanson's original house. And the youngest daughter, Emma, was actually sold by Ruth Baltzel to her father, who at that point was free. And the sale stipulated she was to be manumitted when she reached the age of 10. And she was sold for $1 to her father. So John Thomas stays here in Frederick, the son. But Emma and George and Daniel go with Hester between 1863 and 1865 to New York. They initially,
Anne's still here, enslaved. She's enslaved here too.
that's right, yes. They go initially to live with Dr. Harvey Montgomery and his wife Eliza, who happened to be Eliza Baltzel Montgomery. She was the daughter of Dr. Baltzel. So Hester would have known her from this house. And then by 1870, Hester remarries to a man named Abram Bennett and moves to Auburn, New York, which is where she lives for the rest of her life. So to think about what would prompt her to make that decision in 1863, 1864, consider that in Maryland, even though the Emancipation Proclamation has been issued, that does not apply to Maryland. Maryland was not in rebellion, therefore emancipation did not cover Maryland. Maryland would not see the ending of chattel slavery for another almost 2 years, until November 1st, 1864, when a new state constitution was ratified and abolished slavery in Maryland. So for Hester at this time, once her husband dies, and Frederick has been at that point occupied twice by the Confederate Army, and Hester certainly would have known from growing up here that there was a very real threat of slave catchers. This is one of the things that Jacob Eaglebrecht writes a lot about. He refers to them as soul drivers, but these slave traders who would capture people and sell them into the Deep South. All of those realities had to be present in her mind when she makes that decision to take her youngest children and leave, and bearing in mind that she leaves behind other children
who are still enslaved. That's one of the things that's why I always remember Anne's here too, is that New York, where they go, does census records every 5 years. So we get a little bit of a more detailed snapshot of Hester and what's happening with her. And so like Jody said, in 1864, Hester's 2 remaining children are freed, but in the 1865 census, they're not with her. And so I always think of like, when did Hester learn her children were free? And what barriers are keeping her from bringing them back, specifically her daughter? Like her son is almost an adult at that point, he's a son, but that daughter, that one just gets at me. We know by 1870 she's in New York with her mother, but like Jody said, what a different mindset to know to get the rest of the family out there and those other younger children out of New York. And it's something that Jody and I have been talking about in these different stories of families, because we know Hester goes again to a family that she knew were part of the family of her enslavers. And we see that at Rose Hill as well. So we know that the Robinson family that I talked about that was enslaved by the Thomas family around the Civil War, they owned the house during the Civil War. Keep in mind, Rose Hill at the time went all the way down to 12th Street in Frederick. And Ann Robinson, who was manumitted, her and her husband are living on 6th Street. So just like Jody said, of that community that's on 6th and 7th Street. They're living on 6th Street. They have 3 children that were born free. They have 2 young children who were sold to a man in downtown Frederick that live next door to them, but they are, the children are in the census record as living in their household. And then they have older boys that are enslaved across multiple plantations. And post-Civil War, the Robinson family, her husband dies in the fighting in the USCT to try to fight for the freedom of their remaining children. And so she is now a widow, and she moves with Sieber Arts from library fame. He was the brother-in-law of the owners of Rose Hill, and owns the plantation across the street from Rose Hill at that time, which is now apartments right there at the corner of East Street. She moves and follows them all the way to Chicago. And that same kind of idea that Hester, it goes with the Boltzell and Montgomery family to New York. And then we also see a family, a woman named Mary Nichols, and she is emancipated with the new Constitution in Maryland in 1864, but she remains at Rose Hill on the census records through the 1870s. She's got young children, and then it's not until the marriage of her eldest daughter, who moves to Baltimore, that she moves to Baltimore with her daughter. So this idea of the financial impacts of the community, where she is not able to leave the plantation. She continues to work at the plantation until her daughter is married, and can move along as well. And so obviously there's some gaps in there too, like there are some other things happening in Rose Hill, who knows, but these different stories show different ways that these different women had to navigate being a woman, their marriage status, their economic opportunities, and the communities that they either had or didn't have, and where they go post-emancipation.
That good indication that she was treated fairly.
Possibly, it's hard to tell. And we don't know too, like, we think of the stories too of almost like sharecroppers in the South, right? Like, Maryland obviously had a lot more, like Elizabeth said, these different communities, you're closer to Pennsylvania, different areas. So is it the ability to like, we'll continue to pay wages instead and you can work here, or is it there's no other place for me to go, where I am a single woman with 5 children, where am I going? You're willing to pay me here, and for what wages? We don't know. But yeah, we don't know those dynamics of this interconnectedness to know.
I think it's interesting they went to Auburn where Harriet Tubman was.
It was interesting.
Wait, say that again?
They went to Auburn, New York, that's where Harriet Tubman was. She spent the rest of her life.
Several of you have touched upon this, but maybe you could paint a little clearer picture for me. Multiple times you've mentioned persons who were manumitted before the Civil War. How common was that around here in that time frame? Why was that occurring? It's not something that I would have expected.
Yeah, so what's interesting for us at Rose Hill is we see that difference sharply between the two families. The Johnson and the Grahams did not manumit people. Some of it is that they did not manumit people. Some of it is because the laws changed. Prior to the 1800s, you could not manumit people, right?
Oh, I wasn't aware of that.
So some of it is law and the fluctuations of laws. Some of it is what we talked about earlier of that's an economic asset that they are not willing to part with. Keeping one of the other things that we see is a shift, like I said earlier, on the technology. And so like we see that with the Thomas family, where they enslaved one family across multiple plantations. Rose Hill had primarily most of the women because they had switched to dairy farming instead of even just grain farming. With the westward expansion, the price of grain plummets, and so they start growing the grain to feed the cows, to produce the milk, to put on the railroad to take to Baltimore, right? And so the women at Rose Hill are doing the dairy production, the cheese, the butter making, but their brothers and fathers and family members are walking between the plantations to do that grain work and that agriculture work because they can use the threshing machine. They can use all these other pieces instead of a scythe. And so you see an increase in manumissions in the region. You also see an increase in selling south in that time. So those were the two options. And what's really interesting is right before 1860, the Maryland General Assembly actually is very fearful of the increasingly free Black population and some of the successful slave rebellions. You also think just around the corner from Harper's Ferry. But they passed a law that says in June of 1860, manumissions will not be allowed anymore. We also see that that's not really enforced. But there's a huge spike in manumissions for the 6 months before. There's even newspaper articles of, like, in Frederick County, it was like 300 manumissions in those 6 months because people did not want, this is gonna sound awful to say, they did not want to get stuck with the burden of continuing to keep the enslaved population. So one of the things that they found with these gradual manumissions is a lot of times when you read the records, it will say that they will be manumitted at the age of 30 for men and 35 for women. Anybody know the reason that the women are older? Childbearing years, right? And so these gradual manumissions, the children were still enslaved. Some of them would say that their children would be enslaved until they turned 30 or 35. Some of them said they'd be enslaved forever. And so it became an easier way, a more effective way for them to have the free labor. And then when they were past the prime of their workforce years, to manumit them and then take the children that have been born and continue the labor force. And so that's the main reason in this area that manumission becomes so popular, is also in connection with that technology piece.
So you're not seeing a big altruism going on?
There was some, you saw some pieces of those, especially in children that maybe inherited from a parent and then, but very rarely. Most of it was yeah, definitely not at some of those other places that labor was more
I
expensive.
jump in. I had a student do research in newspapers in the 20s and 30s. There are ads after ad after ad for people who are coming in to buy slaves and at the taverns. And so, great piece of history there. And so, there are too many slaves in Maryland in the 1820s and 30s. So literally, it's shown down south. That's what's happening. As well as
That was mostly, think, technology?
well, there's a variety of things.
It's partly that, it's also the collapse of the grain
Market and natural increase. The more enslaved people, the more children being born over and over and over again, just like any other population.
And you couldn't import from Europe, from Africa anymore. So if you were native born,
I'm just putting all this together.
plantations.
All of a sudden, their worth went up.
Yes,
Yes.
their worth went
And
up.
so
Yeah.
they're
And you see
worth
this.
more
Yeah,
elsewhere.
particularly down south.
I remembered hearing at the Roger Brooks Tawny House one time that at some point in Maryland, the law was that if a slave was not sold by a certain age, then the owner was required to keep them. And is that accurate?
I don't know if it was set a specific age, but there were some laws that they were required to be self-sufficient. And one of the biggest things was that they were worried that that these people in manumit, you're not where you're 65
Yeah.
years old
And all of a sudden.
and you can't do any farm labor, but I still have to pay to feed and clothe you. Get out of here.
Earlier on in New England, where I've done my research, when they were trying to figure out how to have gradual emancipation, the big thing was that the freed people not become public charges.
Correct, yeah.
That those communities gonna have to carry them in any way.
And we see that with Rose Hill, Ann Robinson, her mother Lucy Thompson is manumitted at the death of her enslaver, the rest of the family is given to all of the children, but they are, she is manumitted because her son is also manumitted with her, with the idea that she would live in her son's house. And so she's one of those rare older individuals that's manumitted because she's manumitted with somebody who could be in the workforce and productive and continue to take care of her.
And that framework translates even into the legalese of manumissions, because when you read them, they all include a clause after, they're all formatted relatively the same. I, the enslaver, do hereby free manumit, set free from slavery, name of enslaved person. If it's a termed manumission, to be effective when they reach the age of so and such in the year such and such. Them being able to support themselves essentially, and it's not the exact terminology,
Or I
but they
certify they
say
can support themselves.
they have a skill, they have the means to care for themselves.
But I'm not correct then that there was a specific age.
As far as I know, I mean, I could be mistaken, it's not my full area of expertise of all of those laws, but most of it has been like that idea of they could still take care of themselves, yeah.
Okay.
When the Brits moved people to from Catoctin to Antietam, they moved people who were well into their 60s and beyond and did not manumit them, kept them as enslaved.
So who determined that if they were able to take care of themselves, and what would be the outcome if they were not?
Great question.
They would have to
I
stay.
haven't seen any cases where anybody has been,
Again, I'll say in New England, I don't know that it applies here. The town council
right,
would do stuff like that. And again, New England is different because you have those little town councils. But every town council will get together and meet and decide the circumstances and who's gonna take care of this
On
person.
an
'Cause we-
individual basis.
Yeah,
Interesting.
One resource that shouldn't exist somewhere, that could possibly illuminate that. We have records in the archive here from the Montague home, which was built in the 1870s to replace the county's almshouse or poor farm, which was something that had existed going back to the foundation of the county in the 18th century. And those ledgers document every person who came there to live there. It of course includes their race, it includes their health condition, it includes other information, but unfortunately those records don't start till after the Civil War. If records like that existed somewhere for the almshouse prior, that could be a source that would possibly, if you see a large number of African Americans going into that, because that was essentially the welfare provided by the county
So
at the time.
the slave owner relinquishes responsibility for that person to the state or whatever.
possibly, yeah.
Yeah,
Possibly.
It's one of those things we see a lot with some of these laws where the same thing in 1832, there's a law passed that anybody in the state of Maryland that's manumitted actually has to either be free or has to move out of the state or go to Liberia. And we have less than 1,000 in the state of Maryland that actually end up going to Liberia, right? It was one of those that it might have been a law on the books, but how effective it was to be able to enforce it. Because we know, we just talked about very vibrant communities that stay here in Frederick County by the thousands. So I think it was one of those that it might be a law on the books and people might try to adhere to it or write in documents that I've adhered to this law, but how actually you could enforce it depended on the situation.
So did that law stay in effect then, up until?
I don't know if they ended it before the Civil War or not.
Well, it was funded in the early 1830s.
Yeah, it was 1830, yeah.
They bought a colony in Africa, the state of Maryland.
Right.
And so they had it on the books, and I think they didn't fund it, maybe that's what it was. And so it was
Maybe, yeah,
all
so-
voluntary, so the really.
Unfunded mandate originally,
And so I had a student do that project too, so fascinating that Maryland did it. Francis Scott Key was involved in that.
Some of the Johnsons were involved as well, like later generations of Johnsons.
trying to work around this.
Well, I'm sensing that we're running out of time. Okay, I enjoyed the conversation.
You can
I don't
keep the
know about
three of
you.
us talking
Let's
forever.
Let's take our panelists.
I am so impressed with your knowledge I've always been impressed with Jody's knowledge. I know Jody because he's like a walking encyclopedia. But the three of you together, it's just been amazing.
That's correct.
I just-
Did you notice, I don't know what's on those pieces of paper, but it's not all those words.
It's mainly Jody's email and
Very
reminding you
little
what
on
we're
this
talking
one.
about.
Thank you all for being here
Yes,
tonight
thank
for the
you.
questions and
Can you tell me why that window has a double door underneath it and the other one doesn't?
Oh,
Is
that's
it
a great
something-
question.
Behind you is a double door underneath.
That's
there's
one of
one
our
behind you
favorite,
too.
it's one of
Those
our
are called
favorite
gym
questions.
doors. And you'll see they created a panel to give the impression that it
Yeah.
matches, but if you look from the outside, there's only one at this window, not at that one. Also, we have no evidence that there was ever any stairs to that, so hopefully nobody ever walked out it. Because it's a good ways down to the ground. But the symmetry was why the panels are done that way. But as far as we know, the only one that would have functioned is the one behind you, because it goes out onto the back porch.
The gym doors, one of the things they think is they were for ventilation. That's one of the things I've
Yep.
read about. Cross breeze or whatever.
Yes.
So Jody, if that side was the kitchen, what was this room right here?
We don't know. In the time period that this was an orphanage, this was the dining room.
Okay.
This was where the girls ate. That was still the kitchen.
Susanna, could you hold up the picture?
Yes. Now this picture is taken, right here is the fireplace. This is that window. So they're sitting at a table right here. When the ceiling was taken down in here during the renovation, you could see where the original lighting fixture would have hung here, and also one in the center of the kitchen. But in the time period that this was a private house, the assumption is that the room to the front of us here would have been the dining room. So whether that was maybe the more formal dining room and this was the family's private dining room is a possibility, but we don't know.
There could have been a butler's pantry.
That's what I am.
But we didn't say it in as many words. Those are some of the ornaments.
Oh, yeah.
How many rooms was this house?
There are 2,
Come on,
3,
museum manager.
6, 7, 8, 9, 10. There are 10 rooms upstairs.
And did it have both black and white girls or just white?
In the orphanage, they were all white. That was not,
By the way.
it's not, to my knowledge, written into like the bylaws of the institution, but the way in practice that it was operated there, we do not know of any African American girls that were here.
Very good, thank you.
Thank you.